The third-class carriage rattled northward through October rain, and Thomas Blackwood pressed his forehead against the cold window glass, watching Scotland transform itself mile by mile. Edinburgh's sooty tenements had given way to the rolling lowlands, and now, 6 hours into his journey, the highlands rose before him like sleeping giants wrapped in mist. He shifted on the hard wooden bench, feeling every one of his 42 years in his lower back, and permitted himself a small smile at the irony. A man who spent his days positioning the dead into lifelike poses couldn't manage to find a comfortable position for his own living bones. The letter from Glenmore Estate rested in his waistcoat pocket, its expensive paper stiff against his ribs when he breathed. "Most urgent commission," Lady Glenmore had written, in a hand that trembled slightly across the page. "My late husband's beloved Wolfhound requires your particular expertise." Thomas had read between those careful lines, recognizing the grief that makes people grasp at preserving what remains when the essential thing is lost. He'd seen it often enough in his workshop, the desperate need to hold on to form when spirit has fled. Around him, the carriage filled with the sounds of 1884 Scotland in motion. A merchant arguing about wool prices, two ministers debating predestination in hushed Presbyterian tones, a young mother hushing her infant with Gaelic lullabies that Thomas remembered from his own childhood. Progress and tradition, he mused, locked in their eternal Scottish dance. The railway itself was barely 40 years old on this route, cutting through valleys where Celtic warriors once ambushed Roman legions, yet people already took it for granted. He thought of his workshop on Candlemaker Row, locked and shuttered for the next fortnight. His assistant would manage the simpler commissions, the pet canaries and beloved cats that kept their business steady. But this, a wolfhound for nobility, this required the master's hand. Thomas had built his reputation on such work, though he sometimes wondered if he was preserving memories or manufacturing lies. Every mounted creature was, after all, an elegant deception, glass where eyes should be, carved foam where muscle once moved, arsenic soap where blood once flowed. Margaret would have laughed at his philosophizing. "You think too much, Tom," she'd have said, her consumptive cough interrupting her smile. "The dead are dead, and the living need comfort. Give them that." 3 years now since the consumption took her, and still he heard her voice at unexpected moments. Perhaps that's why he understood his clients so well. He too wanted to preserve what was gone, to deny time its victory. The train wheezed to a stop at Inverness station just as the afternoon light began to fail. Thomas collected his cases, 1 leather bag of personal effects, 2 wooden boxes of tools and materials that never left his custody. The platform swarmed with Highland life. Gamekeepers in tweeds, fishermen reeking of the sea, servants fetching packages for their distant masters. He found the carriage house and negotiated passage to Glenmore, 20 miles into the wild interior. The driver, a weathered man who gave his name simply as Mackenzie, loaded the cases with surprising gentleness. "Taxidermist, are you?" He didn't wait for confirmation. "Headin' to the big house, then. They've had a time of it, they have." Thomas settled into the carriage, curious but cautious. In his experience, servants' gossip was equal parts truth and imagination. "Lord Glenmore passed recently, I understand." "Aye, 6 weeks past. Heart gave out sudden-like, though he was strong as Highland cattle until the end." Mackenzie clicked his tongue at the horses. "But that's not the whole of it, if you take my meaning." The carriage lurched onto the rough track that served as road in these parts. Through the window, Thomas watched the landscape grow wilder. Purple heather giving way to gray stone. Occasional crofts crouched against the wind, like living things trying not to be noticed. The sky, what he could see between racing clouds, had taken on that peculiar Scottish quality of seeming both ancient and immediate. "And what might the whole of it be?" Thomas asked, knowing the man wanted to tell. "The howling, sir. Every night these 2 weeks past, the dead dog howls." Mackenzie's voice dropped as if the Moors themselves might overhear. "Caesar, the master's wolfhound, died of grief, they say, not 2 weeks after his lordship. But his voice carries on the wind when the moon rises." Thomas had heard stranger claims in his profession. Clients who swore their mounted parrots still spoke, cats whose glass eyes seemed to follow them. Grief, he'd learned, could make the most rational person believe impossible things. "I'm sure there's an explanation." "Aye, that's what Mr. Macready says. He's the steward, the late lord's cousin. But her ladyship, poor soul, she's taking it hard. Hardly sleeps, they say. Jumps at shadows." The driver paused to navigate a particularly treacherous turn. "Between you and me, sir, there's them that think she's going the way of her grandmother. Moon-touched, if you understand." The road climbed steadily now, and through the gathering October gloom, Thomas caught his first glimpse of Glenmore Estate. It rose from the moor like something geological rather than architectural, its grey stone walls seeming to grow from the very bones of Scotland. 3 stories of Georgian severity, softened only by the warm glow of gaslight in several windows, suggesting life within the pile of stone. A tower at the east end spoke of older origins, perhaps a fortified house from rougher centuries. As they approached the main entrance, a figure emerged from the shadows, a sturdy man of about 60, wearing the practical clothes of a groundskeeper, but carrying himself with the authority of long service. This would be Hamish Fraser, Thomas realized, remembering the name from Lady Glenmore's letter. "Mr. Blackwood?" The accent was pure Highlands, thick as porridge. "Welcome to Glenmore. I'll see to your cases." He gestured to a waiting footman, then leaned closer to Thomas. "Her ladyship's expecting you, but I should warn you. We've troubles here that go deeper than a dead dog wanting preserved. Keep your eyes open and your tongue careful, if you follow my meaning." Thomas studied the older man's weathered face, reading genuine concern there. "I'm here to practice my trade, Mr. Fraser, nothing more." "Aye, that's what they all say at first." Hamish's expression suggested he'd seen enough of the world to know better. "But Glenmore has a way of drawing folk into its stories, whether they will it or not. The very stones have memories here, and some of them are better left undisturbed." The great oak door opened before Thomas could respond, revealing a properly severe housekeeper whose expression suggested she'd been carved from the same gray stone as the house itself. Behind her, the entrance hall stretched into gas-lit grandeur, wood paneling, oil portraits of stern ancestors, and the peculiar mixture of opulence and discomfort that marked Scottish noble houses. "Mrs. Brodie," the woman announced herself with crisp efficiency. "Her ladyship will receive you after you've refreshed yourself. Dinner is at 8 precisely. Your workshop has been prepared in the old dairy as requested." Thomas followed her up a carved staircase, his footsteps muffled by thick Turkish runners. The house smelled of beeswax, coal fires, and something else, that particular mixture of old wood and older secrets that accumulated in places where generations had lived and died. Somewhere in this pile of stone and tradition, a dead wolfhound supposedly howled in the night. Thomas found himself oddly eager to discover the truth of it, though he suspected the real mystery would prove to be entirely human in origin. Lady Margaret Glenmore received Thomas in what the housekeeper called the Chinese drawing room, though the only oriental element he could identify was a painted silk screen depicting cranes in flight. She sat near the fire, wrapped in black mourning silk that made her pale face seem to float in the gathering darkness. At 38, she retained the kind of beauty that speaks more of bone structure than bloom, but grief had carved new hollows beneath her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she gestured for him to sit. "Mr. Blackwood, how good of you to come so quickly." Her voice carried the refined vowels of Edinburgh education, overlaid with years of Highland living. "I trust your journey wasn't too taxing." Thomas recognized the dance of social pleasantries that preceded any real conversation among the gentry, a waltz he'd learned to perform adequately, if not gracefully. "Most comfortable, your ladyship. Your home is magnificent." "My late husband's home," she corrected gently, then caught herself. "My home now, I suppose. One forgets to adjust one's language." She studied him with eyes the color of winter seas. "You come highly recommended. Lord Hastings' peacock, I'm told, is so lifelike that his spaniel still barks at it." "I strive for accuracy in my work, my lady." A bitter smile touched her lips. "Accuracy, yes. That's what we need here. An accurate portrait of loyalty, preserved forever." She rose, moving to the window where October dusk was settling over the moors. "Tell me, Mr. Blackwood, do you believe the dead can speak?" The question hung in the air like incense. Thomas chose his words carefully. "I believe the living sometimes hear what they need to hear. A diplomat's answer." She turned back to him, and he saw the exhaustion beneath her composure. "Then let me be direct. For the past fortnight, my husband's wolfhound has howled in the night. Caesar has been dead these 4 weeks, yet still I hear him. Grief can— Please," she raised a hand. "Don't insult me with platitudes about grief and imagination. My husband's cousin has already suggested I'm suffering from nervous exhaustion. Dr. Pemberton prescribes laudanum, which I refuse to take. But I know what I hear, Mr. Blackwood. Every night at 2 o'clock precisely, Caesar howls from my husband's study." Thomas leaned forward, interested despite himself. "Always at the same time?" "Like clockwork," she laughed, but there was no humor in it. "How appropriate a phrase." "Everything in this house runs like clockwork now, scheduled, predictable, dead. Even our ghost keeps regular hours." The door opened, admitting a man Thomas recognized from description as Duncan Macready, the estate steward. 45 years old, well-dressed in country tweeds, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested ambition held in check. He possessed what Thomas's father would have called a lawyer's face, pleasant enough, but calculating, weighing every word and gesture for advantage. "Cousin Margaret, you shouldn't tire yourself." His concern seemed genuine, though Thomas noticed how his eyes inventoried the room, noting his presence. "Mr. Blackwood, I presume?" "Duncan Macready. I manage the estate affairs." "Since my husband's death," Lady Margaret added, and something in her tone suggested this was not entirely by her choice. Duncan's smile remained steady. "Someone must attend to practical matters during this difficult time. The world, unfortunately, doesn't pause for grief." He turned to Thomas. "I hope you can complete your work quickly. These
Disturbances have been unsettling for everyone.
"You've heard the howling yourself?" Thomas asked.
I've heard something, Duncan admitted. Wind through the chimneys, most likely. This house is full of drafts and odd acoustics. My late cousin collected curiosities from around the world. Who knows what might produce strange sounds when the wind is right? Lady Margaret's fingers tightened on her mourning dress. It's not the wind. Of course not, dear cousin. I merely suggest natural explanations before we embrace supernatural ones. Duncan's tone remained soothing, but Thomas caught the slight condescension.
"Perhaps Mr. Blackwood would like to see the study. And Caesar himself, of course."
They climbed the main staircase, their footsteps echoing in the vast space.
Family portraits watched their procession, generations of Glenmores with the same strong jaw and suspicious eyes. Lord Alastair's portrait, newly hung and still smelling of oil paint, showed a vigorous man of 55 with iron-gray hair and the kind of face that suggested he suffered no fools. Beside him, painted with loving detail, sat Caesar, a massive Irish wolfhound with intelligent eyes and a coat the color of morning mist. The study door was solid oak, carved with thistles and stags. Duncan produced a key, explaining, "We've kept it locked since his lordship's passing. Nothing's been disturbed except for removing Caesar's body to the ice house." The room beyond took Thomas's breath away. 3 walls lined floor to ceiling with books, but the fourth was a monument to the taxidermist's art. A golden eagle spread its wings above the mantel, frozen in eternal flight. A wildcat crouched on a shelf, glass eyes gleaming with manufactured menace. Red deer heads mounted with scientific precision, showing every stage of antler growth. A collection that spoke of decades of careful acquisition and genuine natural philosophy. "My husband was a great naturalist," Lady Margaret said softly. "He corresponded with Darwin himself, though he disagreed with certain conclusions." Thomas approached the specimens with professional appreciation. The work was exceptional. Some pieces he recognized as coming from Roland Ward's famous London establishment. Others bore the distinctive touch of Scottish masters he knew by reputation. Each mount was positioned not just for display, but for education, showing the animals as they would appear in nature. "Caesar would lie just there," Lady Margaret indicated a Turkish carpet before the fire. "Every evening while Alastair worked." They were inseparable from the day Caesar arrived as a pup 12 years ago. A younger woman entered bearing a tea service. Isabella Murray, Thomas recognized from the servants' descriptions. 28, beautiful in that particular way that suggested Celtic blood mixed with something more exotic. Her dark hair was pinned severely back, appropriate for a companion, but nothing could dim the intelligence in her green eyes. She moved with unusual grace, setting down the tray without a single rattle of china. "Thank you, Bella," Lady Margaret said warmly, and Thomas noted the genuine affection between them. "Bella has been my salvation these past months. I don't know what I'd do without her." "You're too kind, my lady." Bella's accent was educated Glasgow, carefully modulated. She glanced at Thomas with what seemed like assessment. "Will you be starting work tomorrow, Mr. Blackwood?" "If that suits her ladyship, the sooner the better," Duncan interjected. "These nightly disturbances are affecting the entire household. The servants are beginning to talk of curses and hauntings. Superstitious nonsense, of course, but it affects morale." As if in response to his skepticism, the clock on the mantel chimed 8, and Mrs. Brodie appeared to announce dinner. They descended to a dining room that could have seated 30 but was set for 4. Dr. Pemberton had arrived, a distinguished man of 52, with the kind of carefully maintained whiskers that suggested vanity wrestling with age. He greeted Thomas with professional interest. "A taxidermist, how fascinating. I dabble in preservation myself, botanical specimens mainly, though I've attempted some smaller fauna." His enthusiasm seemed genuine. "You must tell me about your methods. I understand the Parisian techniques have advanced considerably." Dinner proceeded with the formal choreography of upper-class meals: soup, fish, fowl, meat, each with its appropriate wine and conversation. Thomas found himself studying the assembled company, reading their interactions like a text. Lady Margaret picked at her food, starting at small sounds. Duncan watched her with concern that might have been genuine or calculated. Bella served as companion, speaking when addressed, but observing everything. Dr. Pemberton dominated conversation with stories of medical oddities and recent scientific discoveries. The study of acoustics, for instance, the doctor expounded over the roast lamb, has revealed remarkable properties of sound transmission. In certain African tribes, hunters use carved instruments to perfectly imitate animal calls. I've collected several specimens myself, purely for scientific interest, you understand. It was then, as the clock in the hall struck 2 in the morning, no, that was wrong, they were still at dinner. But Thomas felt a chill, as if someone had walked over his grave, his mother would have said. Lady Margaret had gone very still, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. "My lady?" Bella touched her arm gently. "Nothing, She set down her fork with deliberate care. "Forgive me. I find I'm more tired than I thought." After dinner, Thomas excused himself, claiming fatigue from travel. But instead of retiring to his room, he made his way back to the study. The gaslight threw shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, and the mounted creatures watched him with their glass eyes. He examined the room methodically, checking windows for drafts, investigating the chimney, testing floorboards for creaks. Everything seemed solid, well-maintained, normal. At 5 minutes before 2 in the morning, he positioned himself in the corridor outside the study. The house had settled into sleep, that particular quality of silence that comes when human activity ceases and buildings resume their private conversations with time. Somewhere, a clock ticked. Somewhere else, wood contracted with a small snap, and then, exactly as the hall clock began to chime 2, it came. A howl, long and mournful, seeming to rise from the very walls themselves. Not the wind. Thomas knew wind in all its voices. This was unmistakably canine, full of loss and longing. It lasted perhaps 20 seconds, fading into silence that seemed deeper for its passing. Lady Margaret's door opened down the corridor. She stood there in a wrapper, her face pale as bone. "You heard it?" "I heard something," Thomas admitted, his mind already cataloging possibilities. "Caesar," she whispered. "My husband always said Caesar would guard this house until the last stone fell. Perhaps he meant it more literally than we knew." Behind her, Bella appeared with a lamp, and further down the corridor, Duncan emerged from his room, fully dressed despite the hour. Dr. Pemberton's door remained closed, though Thomas thought he caught a movement of shadow beneath it. "This has to stop," Duncan said firmly. Cousin Margaret, you need rest, real rest. Perhaps a stay at the seaside, away from all this." "I'm not leaving my home," Lady Margaret interrupted with sudden steel in her voice. "Whatever this is, wherever it comes from, I won't be driven away by it." Thomas found himself oddly moved by her determination. Here was genuine courage, not the manufactured kind that comes from ignorance of danger, but the real thing that persists despite fear. He made a decision that would have surprised his more cautious self. "Give me time," he heard himself say. "Let me work with Caesar, study the situation properly. The dead, in my experience, usually have very living explanations for their activities." Lady Margaret studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. I begin to think you might be exactly what this house needs." The old dairy had been transformed into a workspace that would have satisfied the most demanding craftsman. Morning light streamed through windows that Mrs. Brodie's staff had scrubbed to crystal clarity, illuminating a solid oak table, proper drainage, and hooks in the beams for suspending larger specimens. Someone, Thomas suspected the thoughtful Bella, had even provided a small coal stove to maintain steady temperature. The attention to detail spoke of a household that, despite its current troubles, still functioned with Highland efficiency. Hamish Fraser and 2 groundsmen delivered Caesar's body at precisely 7 o'clock, wrapped in oiled canvas, and preserved these 4 weeks in the estate's icehouse. They placed the bundle on the table with unexpected gentleness, and Hamish lingered after dismissing the others. "Magnificent creature he was," the old groundskeeper said, his weathered hands surprisingly tender as he helped Thomas unwrap the canvas. "Stood near 3 feet at the shoulder. Could bring down a red stag when he was young, though his lordship kept him as companion more than hunter these last years." The Wolfhound emerged from his wrappings like something from Celtic legend. Even in death, Caesar commanded respect, that particular combination of power and grace that marked the ancient breed. His coat, gray as morning mist over the moors, remained largely intact thanks to the icehouse. Thomas ran professional fingers through the fur, checking for damage, noting the texture. This would be challenging work, worthy of his reputation. "Tell me about him," Thomas said, beginning his initial measurements. "Not the facts, I have those. Tell me how he moved, how he behaved, what made him Caesar, rather than just another wolfhound." Hamish settled on a stool, filling his pipe with deliberate ritual. "You understand dogs, then? Each one different as people they are." He lit the pipe, blue smoke curling toward the rafters. "Caesar now, he had dignity. Never begged, never fawned. But for his lordship," the old man paused, searching for words. "It was like they shared one soul between them. The dog knew Lord Alastair's moods before he did himself, would appear at his side moments before his lordship even realized he wanted company." Thomas worked as Hamish talked, sketching the body from multiple angles, noting every detail that would need recreation. The discipline of observation steadied him, provided refuge from the house's strange atmosphere. In his craft, at least, mysteries had solutions: how to suggest life where none existed, how to capture personality in glass and wire. "There now," Hamish pointed with his pipe stem. "That scar on the shoulder happened 6 years back. Poacher's snare caught him while he was running the bounds. The wound went septic, and we thought we'd lose him. But young Dr. Pemberton, well, younger then, he worked a miracle. Spent 3 days and nights nursing Caesar through the fever." Thomas examined the old wound closely. The scar tissue formed an irregular star about 2 inches across, the fur growing white around it. Something seemed odd about the healing pattern, though he couldn't immediately identify what troubled him. He made detailed notes, then began the delicate process of skinning, the foundation of all good taxidermy. "You'll think me daft," Hamish continued, "but I'd swear that dog understood every word spoken in his presence. During his lordship's last illness, Caesar would lie outside the bedchamber door, wouldn't eat, wouldn't move, except when Lady Margaret personally asked him to. When Lord Alistair finally passed, the dog walked into the room, placed his great head on the bed for a moment, then walked out to his usual spot by the study fire. Died there 2 weeks later, peaceful as you please." "Natural death?" Thomas asked, making the first careful incision. "Broken heart, more like." Though Dr. Pemberton said it was his kidneys finally gave out, old age, you know. The doctor offered to examine him proper, scientific-like, but her ladyship wouldn't hear of it. Said Caesar deserved his dignity even in death. The work absorbed Thomas completely for the next 2 hours. The familiar rhythm of blade and measurement, the careful preservation of hide, the meticulous notes that would guide the reconstruction. It was during the removal of tissue from the shoulder area that his knife struck something unexpected. "That's peculiar," he murmured, probing carefully. Hidden within the old scar tissue, barely visible, was a small sphere of wax, no bigger than a child's marble. Thomas extracted it with tweezers, holding it to the light. The wax was old but well preserved, and through its translucent surface he could see what appeared to be paper. Hamish leaned forward, squinting. "What in heaven's name?" Thomas warmed the wax carefully over the stove until he could crack it open. Inside, wrapped in oiled silk, was a piece of paper covered in tiny, precise writing. The message was encoded, numbers and letters in seemingly random arrangement. NM 47129B. Confirm received. Trust no one else. AG. AG. Alistair Glenmore, Thomas said slowly. This was hidden inside the old wound. Someone stitched it beneath the scar tissue. Hamish's pipe had gone out, forgotten in his hand. But why would, he trailed off, then looked sharply at Thomas. "You mustn't speak of this carelessly, Mr. Blackwood. There are currents in this house deeper than you know." Before Thomas could respond, the workshop door opened. Dr. Pemberton entered, carrying a leather case and radiating professional bonhomie. "Mr. Blackwood, I hope I'm not interrupting. I thought you might find these anatomical charts useful. Wolfhound skeletal structure, musculature diagrams." "From my own collection." His eyes fell on Caesar's partially processed form, and something flickered across his face. Regret? Calculation? It passed too quickly to read. "Poor Caesar. I fought so hard to save him from that snare 6 years ago. Spent 3 days here at the estate, monitoring the infection. Lord Glenmore was beside himself with worry." "You stitched the wound yourself?" Thomas asked carefully, palming the small paper. "Indeed. Rather proud of that work, actually. The wound was deep, reached almost to the shoulder joint. Had to clean out significant necrotic tissue." The doctor set his case on a side table, withdrawing several detailed charts. "I made sketches at the time for a paper I was writing on veterinary surgery. Never published it, but the drawings might help your reconstruction." Thomas accepted the charts with appropriate gratitude, noting that Pemberton's drawings were remarkably detailed, perhaps too detailed for simple medical interest. The doctor lingered, asking questions about preservation techniques, chemical solutions, the challenges of maintaining fur color. Professional curiosity, perhaps, but Thomas sensed something more, a probing quality to the queries. After Pemberton left, Bella arrived with the noon meal: soup, bread, cheese, and strong tea. She set the tray down, then surprised Thomas by examining Caesar with no sign of squeamishness. "My father was a factor at a sporting estate near Glasgow," she explained. "I grew up around hunting dogs and game preparation. Death doesn't trouble me as it does some." "And life?" Thomas asked, something about her inviting confidence. "Does that trouble you?" A sad smile touched her lips. "Life is infinitely more complicated than death, Mr. Blackwood. The dead keep their secrets. The living—" She paused, seeming to weigh her words. "The living sometimes have too many secrets to keep." She moved closer to the table, her voice dropping. "That wound on Caesar's shoulder, Lord Glenmore once told me it nearly killed more than just the dog. He said secrets had been buried with that injury that were better left undisturbed." "Did he say what secrets?" "No, but in his final weeks, he grew increasingly concerned about the estate's future. He would work late into the night, studying geological surveys, mineral rights documents. He said something about ensuring Lady Margaret's security, about not trusting—" She stopped abruptly. "Not trusting whom?" Bella glanced toward the door. "He never said directly. But he stopped sharing his plans with Mr. Macready, stopped consulting Dr. Pemberton on estate matters. He said Caesar was the only one he could trust completely." She laughed bitterly. "Imagine that! Trusting a dog more than your own family and friends." After she left, Thomas returned to his work with renewed concentration. The wax ball wasn't the only secret hidden in Caesar's remains. As he carefully examined the body cavity, he found evidence of a second surgery, more recent, perhaps performed in the weeks before the dog's death. Someone had made a small incision near the stomach, so skillfully hidden it was almost invisible. Working with extreme care, he investigated the area and discovered another wax-sealed message. This one was different, the paper fresher, the writing more hurried. Pattern confirmed. The howling starts when moon is dark. Someone wants her gone. Guard yourself. The Wolfhound still hunts. A.G. Thomas sat back, mind racing. Lord Glenmore had used his beloved dog as a living message carrier, hiding communications in the animal's own body. But communications with whom, and about what? The references to howling were particularly intriguing, given current events. Had Lord Glenmore somehow anticipated what would happen after his death? The afternoon wore on as Thomas continued his methodical work, carefully preserving Caesar's hide, creating the plaster molds that would guide the mannequin construction. His hands performed familiar tasks while his mind wrestled with unfamiliar puzzles. The sun was setting, painting the workshop in shades of gold and amber when he made his third discovery. Inside Caesar's collar, sewn into the leather itself with tiny, almost invisible stitches, was a thin metal tube no longer than his thumb. Inside the tube, a map, hand-drawn, showing the Glenmore estate with various locations marked with symbols. One mark, near what appeared to be an old mine shaft, was circled 3 times and annotated, "The true wealth. Keep her safe." Thomas carefully copied all 3 messages into his notebook, using his own private shorthand that no one else could read. Then, he returned the originals to their hiding places. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal these messages. and he wouldn't disturb that design without understanding it better. As darkness fell, he secured the workshop and returned to the main house. He found Lady Margaret in the Chinese drawing room, staring into the fire with unseeing eyes. She looked up as he entered, hope and fear warring in her expression. "How is the work progressing?" "Well, my lady, Caesar was a magnificent animal. I'll do him justice." She smiled, the first genuine warmth he'd seen from her. "Alistair always said Caesar was more than just a dog. He said he was a guardian, a keeper of secrets." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I'm beginning to think he meant that quite literally." Thomas spent the early morning hours hunched over his notebook in the workshop, trying to decode Lord Glenmore's cryptic messages. The numbers seemed to follow a pattern. Coordinates, perhaps, or references to books in the library. NM 47129B could indicate anything from map positions to page numbers. His father had taught him basic ciphers during the long Edinburgh winters, entertaining a curious boy with puzzles and codes, but this exceeded his amateur knowledge. The mannequin for Caesar was taking shape on his workbench, wire armature wrapped in wood wool, carefully sculpted to match his detailed measurements. The physical work provided refuge from mental frustration. Each twist of wire, each application of clay to build muscle forms, brought Caesar closer to his second life. Thomas found himself talking to the emerging form, an old habit from his workshop that helped him think. "Your master was cleverer than most, wasn't he murmured, adjusting the angle of the neck. "But perhaps too clever. Secrets hidden inside secrets. And now he's gone and you're gone. And who's left to explain the game?" A soft knock interrupted his musings. Bella entered carrying tea and what appeared to be an old leather journal. She moved with that particular grace he'd noticed before, setting down the tray without disturbing his tools. "I thought you might need sustenance," she said, then hesitated. "And perhaps assistance." Thomas looked up sharply. "With what, exactly?" She pulled a stool close to his workbench, her green eyes serious. "I saw you copying something yesterday. You had the look of a man wrestling with a puzzle." When he didn't respond, she continued. "Lord Glenmore taught me his cipher system. He said a woman in my position might need to send messages that others couldn't read." "Your position?" "Companion to a lady in a house full of men who think they know better." Her smile held no warmth. He was protective of Lady Margaret, knew that his cousins had their own ideas about the estate's future. Thomas considered carefully, then showed her his transcription of the first message. She studied it with immediate recognition. "It's a location marker," she said. "NM is North Moor, the section beyond the old mine workings. The numbers are paces from established landmarks. His lordship was precise about such things." She opened the journal she'd brought. This was his private survey book. He gave it to me 2 days before he died, said I might need it to protect Lady Margaret. Together they worked through the cipher. The first message indicated a location where Lord Glenmore had hidden geological surveys proving significant copper deposits on the estate. The second message was more disturbing. It suggested Lord Glenmore knew about the howling before it started, that he anticipated someone would try to drive Lady Margaret from the estate. "But how could he know?" Thomas asked. "He died 6 weeks ago. The howling started 2 weeks past." Bella's fingers traced the journal's worn pages. he was investigating something in his final weeks. Correspondence with Edinburgh lawyers, meetings with mining speculators. Mr. Macready was furious about being excluded from these discussions. Dr. Pemberton, too, seemed hurt by the sudden distance. The workshop door burst open. Duncan Macready stood there, his usually composed face showing irritation. His eyes took in their proximity, the journal between them, and his expression hardened. "Miss Murray, Lady Margaret requires your assistance. Immediately." Bella rose smoothly, taking the journal with her. "Of course, Mr. Macready." She nodded to Thomas. "Thank you for explaining your process, Mr. Blackwood. Most educational." After she left, Duncan remained, studying the partially constructed mannequin with an unreadable expression. "You work quickly." "I find focus helps the craft." "Indeed, focus is admirable. Though sometimes, Mr. Blackwood, too much focus on one thing blinds us to other dangers." He picked up one of Thomas's sculpting tools, testing its weight. "My cousin's estate is complex. Many interests intersect here: family, business, legal matters. A wise man would concentrate on his commission and avoid entanglements." "Is that a warning, Mr. Macready?" "Advice from someone familiar with the terrain." He set down the tool with deliberate care. Caesar was just a dog, after all. Whatever mysteries you think you're uncovering, remember that. Just a dog. And dogs can't testify to anything, living or dead. That night, the howling came at 2 o'clock as usual, but this time Thomas was ready. He'd positioned himself not in the corridor, but in a storage room with a view of the study door. When the sound began, that mournful, penetrating cry, he watched carefully. A shadow moved at the far end of the corridor, someone in dark clothing keeping close to the wall. The figure paused at the study door, and Thomas heard the subtle click of a key. The howling continued for its usual duration, then stopped abruptly. The figure emerged, locked the door again, and disappeared down the servants' stair. Thomas followed at a careful distance, his stockinged feet silent on the floor. The trail led to the ground floor, through the kitchen, dark and smelling of banked fires, and out toward the garden door. But when Thomas reached the door, he found it locked from inside. Whoever he'd been following had vanished, seemingly into the walls themselves. He stood there in the darkness, puzzling over the impossibility, when a hand touched his shoulder. He nearly cried out before recognizing Hamish Fraser's weathered face in the moonlight from the window. "Secret passages," the old man whispered. "This house is full of them. Built during the Jacobite troubles, when the family needed quick escapes. His lordship knew them all, but he wasn't the only one." "Who else?" "Those who've lived here long enough. Served here long enough. Come." Hamish led him to what appeared to be solid wood paneling near the pantry. His fingers found hidden catches, and a section swung inward, revealing narrow stairs descending into blackness. The smell of centuries rose from below, stone and dampness and secrets. "These run all through the house," Hamish explained. "Connect to the old tower, the wine cellars, even outside to the old ice house. A man who knows the ways could move unseen, appear and disappear like a ghost." "Or make a dead dog howl," Thomas said quietly. "Aye, that too." They heard footsteps approaching, heavy, confident. Dr. Pemberton appeared in the kitchen doorway, fully dressed despite the hour, carrying his medical bag. "Gentlemen, Rather late for a gathering." His tone was pleasant, but his eyes were sharp. "Lady Margaret had another episode. I've given her a mild sedative." "Against her wishes?" Thomas asked. "For her own good. This hysteria about howling dogs is affecting her health. A few nights of proper sleep will restore perspective." He adjusted his bag with practiced motion. "I'm actually glad to find you both here. This situation is becoming serious. Lady Margaret's grandmother suffered from dementia in her final years, heard voices, saw visions. These conditions can be hereditary." Hamish's face darkened. "Her ladyship is as sane as any of us. For now, perhaps. But the strain of grief, combined with these nightly disturbances—" Pemberton sighed with apparent sympathy. "I've seen it before. The mind creates phantoms to fill the void left by loss. If she continues to deteriorate, we may need to consider professional care. There are excellent facilities in Edinburgh, discreet, comfortable." "Asylums, you mean," Thomas said flatly. "Therapeutic retreats. But yes, if her condition warrants." The doctor's expression remained professionally neutral. "I've discussed this with Mr. Macready. As her nearest male relative, he would need to make such decisions if she becomes incapable." The implications hung heavy in the darkness. If Lady Margaret were declared incompetent, Duncan would control the estate. The hidden copper deposits, the fortune Lord Glenmore had tried to protect, all would fall into other hands. After Pemberton left, Hamish spat in disgust. "Therapeutic retreat, my eye. They mean to drive her mad, then lock her away." "The howling?" "Part of it, aye. But there's more." The old man looked toward the hidden passage. "I've served this family 40 years. Seen the old lord pass and young Alistair take his place. Watched him build this estate into something grand. He wasn't perfect, had his secrets, his failings. But he loved Lady Margaret truly. Would have done anything to protect her." "Including hiding messages in his dog?" Hamish started, then smiled grimly. "So you found them? I wondered. I helped him with the second one, just before Caesar died. His lordship could barely stand by then, but he insisted. Said Caesar had one more duty to perform." "What duty?" "To reveal the truth when the time was right. To protect Lady Margaret when he no longer could." Hamish moved toward the door. "You should know that wound 6 years ago, it wasn't a poacher's snare. Caesar was shot, deliberately, while carrying a message to his lordship's solicitor in Inverness. Someone knew about the message system even then." "Who?" "His lordship never said for certain, but afterward he stopped trusting anyone completely, except Caesar. And perhaps," Hamish paused, "perhaps the daughter he could never acknowledge." Thomas's mind raced. "Bella? I've said too much. But Mr. Blackwood, if you truly want to help Lady Margaret, finish your work on Caesar quickly. The longer this continues, the more danger she faces, and not just from howling in the night." Dr. Pemberton's residence stood 3 miles from the estate, a converted manse that squatted against the hillside like a stone toad. Thomas had borrowed the estate's trap, claiming need for specialized materials from the village, though his true purpose lay in understanding the man who spoke so easily of asylums and inheritance. The October morning was sharp with coming winter, and his breath misted as he tied the horse to the gatepost. The housekeeper who answered seemed unsurprised by his visit. "The doctor said you might call, Mr. Blackwood. He's in his study, the collection room, he calls it." She led him through corridors lined with specimen cases, each containing preserved examples of Highland fauna. not taxidermy, but creatures floating in glass jars, pinned to boards, dried and labeled with scientific precision. The smell of formaldehyde and camphor grew stronger as they progressed, until Thomas felt he was walking through death itself, catalogued and shelved. The study door opened onto controlled chaos. Every surface bore specimens, birds' eggs arranged by size and color, butterflies pinned in geometric patterns, skulls graduated from mouse to red deer. But what drew Thomas's immediate attention were the instruments mounted on the far wall: carved tubes, hollow reeds, peculiar gourds with carefully placed holes. "Acoustic devices," Pemberton said from behind a desk piled with papers. "From my travels in Africa and the Orient, each one capable of producing specific animal calls with remarkable accuracy." He rose, moving to the wall with obvious pride. "This one, for instance," he lifted a curved horn of some exotic antelope, "creates a perfect imitation of a lion's roar when blown correctly. The Maasai use it to drive prey during hunts." "Impressive collection," Thomas said carefully, noting a device that looked remarkably suited to producing a howling sound. "Science demands comprehensive study." Pemberton selected another instrument, this one carved from what appeared to be bone. "Sound, Mr. Blackwood, is merely vibration through air. With proper understanding of acoustic principles, any sound can be reproduced, even, say, the howl of a wolfhound." The challenge in his tone was unmistakable. Thomas decided on directness. "Are you suggesting the howling at Glenmore is manufactured?" "I'm suggesting nothing. Merely observing that natural explanations exist for supposedly supernatural phenomena." The doctor returned the instrument to its place with precision. "Though I must say, your presence at the estate has coincided with increased disturbances. Lady Margaret grows more agitated daily. Perhaps because those around her speak so readily of madness and institutions?" Pemberton's expression hardened. "I've been the Glenmore family physician for 15 years. I've seen Lady Margaret through influenza, miscarriages, the slow decline of her husband. My concern for her welfare is entirely genuine." "Yet you discuss commitment papers with Mr. Macready." "Because someone must be practical. The estate requires steady management. If Lady Margaret is incapacitated by grief and delusion, decisions must be made." He moved to his desk, shuffling papers with apparent casualness. "Did you know Lord Glenmore consulted me about his own mental state in his final weeks? Paranoia, he feared, seeing conspiracies where none existed." "What kind of conspiracies?" "He believed someone was trying to steal the estate's future wealth. Copper deposits, he claimed, though no survey has found anything significant. He hid documents, sent secret messages, trusted no one. Classic symptoms of dementia brought on by his heart condition, reduced blood flow to the brain." Thomas studied the doctor's face, reading satisfaction beneath professional concern. "Yet he seemed lucid enough to manage complex affairs until his death." "Madness can be selective, Mr. Blackwood." Men have been known to appear completely rational while harboring the most fantastic delusions. Pemberton pulled out a particular paper. "I have here my medical notes from his final examination, 2 days before his death. Would you care to see them?" The document was thorough, clinical, damning in its implications. According to Pemberton's observations, Lord Glenmore showed signs of persecution mania, auditory hallucinations, and delusional thinking about hidden enemies. If accepted as truth, it painted a picture of a man whose final arrangements, including any hidden messages, could be dismissed as madness. "You documented this thoroughly," Thomas observed. "I'm a man of science. Documentation is essential." Pemberton took back the papers. "Which brings me to my concern about your activities. Mrs. Brodie mentions you've been asking questions, exploring the house at night, encouraging Lady Margaret's delusions about Caesar."
This isn't helpful. I'm simply completing my commission.
"Are you? Or are you perhaps taking advantage of a grieving widow's vulnerability?" The doctor's tone remained pleasant, but threat lurked beneath. "It would be unfortunate if someone were to question your intentions. A working man, alone with a wealthy widow, filling her head with stories about messages from beyond." Before Thomas could respond, raised voices echoed from outside. They moved to the window to see Hamish Fraser arguing with two men Thomas didn't recognize, rough-looking fellows with the bearing of ex-soldiers or constables. "Ah," Pemberton said mildly. "Mr. Macready's insurance. He's hired private guards to patrol the estate, concerned about Lady Margaret's safety given her deteriorating condition. They're to prevent her from harming herself or others during her episodes. She's shown no signs of violence, not yet, but these conditions escalate.
Better to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best." The doctor turned from the window. "I should return with you. Lady Margaret requires her morning examination." The journey back to Glenmore passed in tense silence. Thomas's mind churned through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. The guards were already at the gate when they arrived, checking his borrowed trap as if he might be smuggling something. Their presence transformed the estate from refuge to prison. In the workshop, Thomas found Bella waiting, her usual composure cracked with worry. "They've restricted Lady Margaret to her rooms," she said immediately. "Mr. Macready says it's for her own protection, but she's effectively imprisoned." "On whose authority?" "Dr. Pemberton's medical recommendation, apparently. He's convinced Mrs. Brodie that her ladyship is danger to herself." Bella's hands clenched.
Last night's howling was the worst yet. It went on for nearly an hour, and Lady Margaret tried to break down the study door. They had to restrain her. Thomas thought of the acoustic devices in Pemberton's collection. An hour of manufactured howling would drive anyone to desperate action. Where was everyone when this happened? Mr. Macready was supposedly in his room. Dr. Pemberton arrived within minutes, remarkably quick for someone who lives 3 miles away, almost as if he was expecting the summons. She paused, then added quietly, "I searched Lord Glenmore's correspondence this morning. 6 years ago, just after Caesar was shot, he wrote to his solicitor about changing his will. The letter mentions betrayal by one I trusted with my life. The timing matches Caesar's wound. Yes. And shortly after, Dr. Pemberton published a paper on Highland geology that earned him recognition from the Royal Society. The survey data he used was remarkably similar to Lord Glenmore's private research." Thomas absorbed this, pieces of the puzzle clicking together. He stole Glenmore's geological findings? I believe so. And Lord Glenmore knew, but couldn't prove it. So he hid his most important discovery, the copper deposits, where no one would think to look. Inside Caesar, among other places. Bella moved closer, lowering her voice further. There's something else. I am Lord Glenmore's daughter. Hamish told you truly. My mother was a governess here 28 years ago. His lordship provided for my education, found me positions, but never acknowledged me publicly. His title, the estate, everything had to pass to legitimate heirs, or, failing that, his closest male relative, Duncan Macready. Unless Lady Margaret inherits fully and can dispose of it as she wishes, which she would do, his lordship told me, ensuring I received fair provision. Her green eyes met his directly.
That's why I'm here, Mr. Blackwood, not just as companion, but as guardian. My father asked me to protect Lady Margaret, knowing others would try to steal what he'd built. The workshop door rattled. Duncan Macready entered without waiting for permission, followed by one of the new guards. His face was flushed with anger or drink, possibly both. "Miss Murray, you're needed upstairs. Lady Margaret is having another episode." When Bella hesitated, his tone sharpened. "Now, Miss Murray, unless you want Dr. Pemberton to sedate her again." After she left, Duncan turned to Thomas. "Your work here is nearly finished, I trust. Caesar looks almost complete."
Thomas glanced at the mannequin, now covered with the preserved hide, awaiting only final touches.
"A few more days. Make it sooner. The atmosphere in this house is becoming unbearable."
Once Caesar is mounted and displayed, perhaps we can put an end to these nightly disturbances, and Lady Margaret can receive proper treatment for her condition. You seem very certain she needs treatment. Duncan's expression turned cold. "I'm certain of what I see. A woman driven to hysteria by grief and imagination. If she continues this way, she'll need professional care. Dr. Pemberton knows of an excellent facility in Edinburgh, discreet, comfortable. She'd receive the best treatment while the estate's affairs are properly managed. By you. By someone competent, yes." He gestured to the guard. "McPherson here will be checking the workshop regularly, ensuring everything remains secure. We wouldn't want any accidents to damage your work." The threat was clear. Thomas watched them leave, then returned to Caesar. The Wolfhound's glass eyes were installed now, seeming to watch him with patient intelligence. Somewhere in this house, someone was using Dr. Pemberton's acoustic devices to manufacture a haunting. Someone was moving through secret passages, orchestrating Lady Margaret's descent toward madness, and time was running out to prevent it. The library at Glenmore held 10,000 volumes, their leather spines forming a fortress of knowledge around Thomas and Bella as they worked by lamplight. Lady Margaret slept upstairs, finally succumbing to exhaustion after refusing Dr. Pemberton's laudanum for the third time. The new guards patrolled outside, their boots crunching on gravel with mechanical regularity, but here among the books, a different kind of search was underway. The second message mentioned, "The Wolfhound still hunts," Bella said, running her finger along Lord Glenmore's journal. He often used hunting metaphors in his private writings. Here, 3 weeks before his death, the pack circles, but the old wolf knows their scent. Thomas compared this to his decoded notes. Using Lord Glenmore's cipher and the coordinate system from his survey maps, they'd identified 3 locations on the estate where documents might be hidden. But accessing them would require evading both guards and the watchful eyes of Duncan Macready. "Your father was remarkably thorough in his precautions," Thomas observed. "He had to be. The copper deposits are worth a fortune, enough to secure the estate for generations. But more than that." Bella pulled out a letter, aged and yellowed. "This is from 1858, when he was young. He writes about his vision for Glenmore, not just preserving it, but making it a beacon of Highland prosperity. Employment for local families, education for their children. The copper would fund all of it." Mrs. Brodie entered quietly, carrying tea and wearing an expression of determined conspiracy. "Mr. Macready's retired for the evening," she announced, setting down the tray with practiced silence. "And Dr. Pemberton's returned to his residence. You have perhaps 2 hours before the next patrol checks the house interior." Thomas looked at her with surprise. The stern housekeeper had seemed entirely aligned with propriety and order. She read his expression and permitted herself a thin smile. "I've served this family for 30 years, Mr. Blackwood. I knew Lord Alistair as a young man, watched him court Lady Margaret, celebrated their wedding. Whatever Mr. Macready thinks, I know madness when I see it, and her ladyship isn't mad. She's being tormented." "You've heard the howling yourself?" "Heard it, yes, but more than that." She reached into her apron, producing a small object wrapped in cloth. "I found this in the study this morning, hidden behind Caesar's memorial plaque." It was an acoustic device, similar to those Thomas had seen in Dr. Pemberton's collection, carved bone with carefully placed holes designed to produce a howling sound when air passed through it. But this one showed signs of recent use, its surface still slightly damp with breath moisture. "Someone's been entering the study at night," Mrs. Brodie continued, "through the old passages, I'd warrant. Lord Alistair showed them to me years ago in case of fire or other emergency. There's an entrance behind the portrait of his grandfather." Bella stood quickly. "Then we can trace who's been—" "Carefully," Thomas warned. "If they realize we know about the passages, they'll change tactics. We need proof that will stand up to legal scrutiny, not just our suspicions." Mrs. Brodie nodded approvingly. "Spoken like a man who understands how the world works. But there's more. Yesterday, while cleaning Mr. Macready's room, I found correspondence with an Edinburgh legal firm. They're preparing commitment papers for Lady Margaret, citing hereditary madness and danger to herself." "How long before they act?" "The documents arrive tomorrow. Dr. Pemberton need only sign them, testifying to her condition." The housekeeper's mouth set in a grim line. "Once she's committed, Mr. Macready becomes guardian of the estate. Any documents Lord Alistair hid become irrelevant. Duncan would have years to find and destroy them, while Lady Margaret rots in an asylum." They worked through the night, following Lord Glenmore's coded directions to the first hiding place, a false bottom in Caesar's memorial case in the study. Moving through the house like shadows, avoiding the predetermined patrol routes Mrs. Brodie had memorized, they reached the study through the main corridor rather than the secret passages. The memorial case stood beside the fireplace, an elaborate piece of Scottish craftsmanship that had held Caesar's collar, favorite toys, and a painted miniature of the dog with his master. Thomas ran his fingers along the base, finding the hidden catch Lord Glenmore's notes described. With a soft click, the bottom panel swung open. Inside lay a leather portfolio containing geological surveys, mineral assays, and most importantly, a document dated just 1 week before Lord Glenmore's death, his true last will and testament, properly witnessed by the local minister and postmaster, neither of whom Duncan Macready could influence. Bella read it with shaking hands. "He leaves the estate to Lady Margaret entirely, with provision that she may dispose of it as she sees fit. And here, to Isabella Murray, my unacknowledged daughter, I leave the sum of £20,000 and all mineral rights to the Northmoor copper deposits, with the request that she use this wealth to care for my beloved wife, should anything befall me." £20,000, Thomas breathed. A fortune by any measure. Enough to ensure Bella's independence for life. But only if this will stands, Bella said quietly. Duncan has an earlier will that leaves him as remainder beneficiary if Lady Margaret dies or is declared incompetent. He probably doesn't even know this one exists. A sound from the corridor froze them both. Footsteps, but not the heavy tread of the guards. These were lighter, more careful. Thomas quickly closed the memorial case and pulled Bella behind the heavy curtains just as the study door opened. Dr. Pemberton entered, carrying a dark lantern and moving with the confidence of familiarity. He went straight to the grandfather portrait, pressed hidden catches, and a section of wall swung inward. But instead of entering the passage, he placed something just inside, another acoustic device, Thomas realized, positioned to project sound into the study when activated from within the passage. The doctor then moved to Lord Glenmore's desk, searching through papers with quick efficiency. He pulled out several sheets, holding them to his lantern to read. His satisfied grunt suggested he'd found what he wanted, perhaps more of Lord Glenmore's geological notes that could support his own academic claims. After Pemberton left through the main door, Thomas and Bella emerged from hiding. "He's preparing for tonight's performance," Thomas said grimly. "But now we know how it's done. The question is whether we can prove his involvement." They made their way back through darkened corridors, the will and surveys safely in Bella's possession. As they reached the library, they encountered Hamish Fraser, keeping his own watch in the shadows. "Found what you were looking for?" he asked quietly. "The will, yes. But we need more to prove the conspiracy." Hamish smiled grimly. "Then you'll want to know what I discovered tonight. Macpherson, the new guard, used to work at Pemberton's clinic in Edinburgh, specifically at the asylum wing where they keep the difficult cases. He's experienced at restraining patients who resist their treatment." "They're planning to take her by force," Bella said, horrified. "Tomorrow, I'd guess. After tonight's howling drives her to a crisis." Hamish pulled out a flask, taking a quick sip before continuing. "But there's something else. I searched Caesar's kennel in the old stable, where he spent his last days. Found this tucked into his bedding." It was another note in Lord Glenmore's hand, but this one was different, a confession of sorts. "I was wrong to trust Elias Pemberton with my research. He's brilliant but corrupt, willing to claim others' work as his own. The copper deposits must be protected from him and from Duncan's greed. If something happens to me, look for the truth in Caesar's final rest. The faithful hound guards his master's honor even in death." "He knew," Thomas said slowly. "Lord Glenmore knew they might kill him." "His heart was weak," Hamish confirmed. "Dr. Pemberton treated him with digitalis, said it would strengthen the heartbeat. But too much digitalis stops the heart entirely," Bella finished. Murder disguised as natural death. The clock in the hall chimed 1:30. In 30 minutes, the howling would begin again. Thomas made a decision that would have seemed insane a week ago, but now felt like the only option. "We need to catch them in the act. Tonight, when the howling starts, we confront them with evidence. But first, we need Lady Margaret awake and coherent, not hysterical from the sound." Mrs. Brodie, who'd been standing guard at the library door, spoke up. "I can manage that. Cotton wool in her ears, a sleeping draught, a real one, not Pemberton's laudanum. She'll sleep through the worst of it." "And Caesar?" Bella asked. "The taxidermy's nearly complete. Thomas thought of the mounted wolfhound waiting in his workshop, glass eyes reflecting lamplight, preserved in eternal watchfulness. Caesar has one more service to perform for his master. Hamish, I need you to help me move him to the study before 2 o'clock. Moving Caesar's mounted form through the darkened house required all of Thomas's craft and Hamish's knowledge of the estate's hidden corners. The wolfhound stood magnificent in death, 3 feet at the shoulder, positioned in a noble stance with head raised as if scenting the wind. They carried him wrapped in canvas, using the servants' stairs to avoid the patrolling guards, finally positioning him in the study, exactly where the living Caesar once kept watch. Thomas arranged the mount carefully, angling it to catch the moonlight from the tall windows. In the silvered darkness, Caesar looked almost alive, his glass eyes holding depths that seemed to shift with each change of shadow. Hamish muttered something in Gaelic, a blessing or ward against evil, Thomas couldn't tell which. "He looks ready to howl himself," the groundskeeper whispered. "Perhaps he will, in his own way." Thomas made final adjustments to the positioning. Now we wait. They concealed themselves in the window alcove, heavy curtains providing cover while still allowing them to observe the room. Bella had taken position in the secret passage entrance, ready to block any retreat. Mrs. Brodie kept watch over Lady Margaret, ensuring she remained deeply asleep despite whatever sounds might come. At 5 minutes before 2, the study door opened softly. Duncan Macready entered, moving with the confidence of someone who believed himself unobserved. He carried a small lantern, shielded to cast minimal light, and went directly to the portrait hiding the passage entrance. "Punctual as always," he murmured to someone still in the corridor. "Is everything prepared?" Dr. Pemberton appeared, carrying his medical bag and wearing an expression of grim satisfaction. "The commitment papers are signed. After tonight's episode, we'll have ample justification to transport her immediately. McPherson has the carriage ready. And the howling will be particularly dramatic tonight? I've improved the acoustic device. The sound will seem to come from multiple directions, as if Caesar's spirit is truly roaming the house." Pemberton set down his bag, extracting what looked like a modified version of the bone collar Thomas had seen earlier. "The beauty is, once she's committed, we can discover the device and claim she placed it herself. Proof of her derangement." Duncan smiled coldly. "Brilliant. Though I do wonder what my dear cousin would think of our enterprise. Alistair was a fool, sitting on a fortune in copper while preaching about responsibility to tenants and tradition. Progress demands sacrifice, Duncan. The Highland estates that survive will be those that embrace industrial development. Speaking of which, have you found his final survey? The one showing the exact copper locations? Not yet, but once Margaret is gone and you control the estate, we'll have unlimited time to search." Pemberton moved toward the passage entrance, then stopped abruptly. "What the devil?" Caesar's mounted form stood exactly where they'd placed it, but in the moonlight, with shadows playing across the carefully preserved features, the wolfhound seemed to watch them with knowing eyes. Duncan stepped back involuntarily. "When did this arrive?" Pemberton demanded. "It must be Blackwood's work. Nearly finished from the look of it." Duncan approached the mount cautiously. Remarkable likeness, almost too lifelike. Superstitious nonsense. It's wire and wool beneath that hide, nothing more. But Pemberton's voice carried less certainty than his words. "Come, it's nearly 2. They opened the passage entrance, and Pemberton positioned himself just inside with his acoustic device. Duncan remained in the study, ready to witness Lady Margaret's hysteria when she inevitably responded to the howling. The clock began to chime 2. Pemberton raised the device to his lips. "That won't be necessary, gentlemen." Thomas stepped from concealment, holding the original acoustic device Mrs. Brodie had found. Duncan spun around, face flushing with anger and shock. "Blackwood, what are you preventing a crime, Mr. Macready? Specifically, the false commitment of a sane woman and the theft of an estate worth considerably more than you realize." Pemberton emerged from the passage, his composure cracking. "You're trespassing, Blackwood. These are private family matters." "Murder is rarely private, Doctor." Bella appeared from the opposite passage entrance, blocking Pemberton's retreat. She held Lord Glenmore's journal and the new will. "We know about the digitalis. How you slowly poisoned Lord Alastair while pretending to treat his heart condition." "Preposterous accusations from a servant girl," Duncan snarled, but sweat beaded on his forehead. "From Lord Glenmore's daughter, actually." Bella stepped fully into the moonlight, and her resemblance to the portraits on the walls was undeniable. "My father suspected your plot weeks before his death. That's why he hid evidence where you'd never think to look, inside Caesar himself." Hamish entered through the main door, accompanied by a man Thomas recognized as the local constable, summoned earlier by Mrs. Brodie's nephew, who'd ridden hard from the village. "Constable Morrison," Hamish announced formally. "These men have been conspiring to defraud Lady Margaret Glenmore through false imprisonment in an asylum." "And murder," Thomas added, producing the notes they'd found. Lord Glenmore documented his suspicions about the digitalis poisoning. He knew his heart was failing faster than it should. Pemberton laughed, though it sounded forced. "The ravings of a dying man with dementia. I have medical notes proving his mental deterioration." "Notes you wrote after the fact," Thomas countered. "We have witnesses who can testify to Lord Glenmore's clarity until his final days. And more importantly, we have this." He moved to Caesar's mount, reaching into the carefully concealed opening he'd left in the stitching. From within the body cavity, he extracted a small vial he'd discovered during his final work, a vial containing white powder. "Digitalis," he said simply, "hidden by Lord Glenmore when he realized he was being poisoned, marked with the date and Pemberton's own prescription label. He knew he was dying, but he wanted proof of how." Duncan made a desperate move toward the door, but the constable's deputy blocked his path. "You can't prove anything."
That will is obviously forged.
"Witnessed by Reverend Mackenzie and Postmaster Harrison," Bella interrupted. "Both upstanding men who've already confirmed their signatures." The sound that came next surprised everyone. A low, mournful howl that seemed to rise from the mounted wolfhound itself. Thomas realized the wind had shifted, blowing through the acoustic device Pemberton had dropped, which had landed perfectly positioned near Caesar's form. For a moment, even he believed the dead dog had given voice. "Fitting," said a voice from the doorway. Lady Margaret stood there, wrapped in a dark shawl, very much awake and entirely composed. Caesar always did know when vermin threatened his territory. "Margaret," Duncan started toward her, "you should be resting." "I've been resting while listening to everything through Mrs. Brodie's excellent ears," she said coldly. "Did you really think I'd take mysterious sleeping draughts from servants without question?" "I have suspected for weeks that someone was manufacturing the howling, but I needed to know who and why. She moved to stand beside Caesar's mount, one hand resting on the great head. "My husband was many things, Mr. Macready, but never a fool. He knew you coveted the estate, knew Dr. Pemberton had stolen his research before, so he prepared for your betrayal." "You can't prove murder," Pemberton said desperately. "Alistair had a weak heart, which you weakened further with excessive digitalis, documented in your own prescription records, which the constable will no doubt examine." Lady Margaret's voice carried the authority of certainty. "But even without that, conspiracy to commit fraud through false medical testimony is sufficient for significant prison time." The constable stepped forward. "Dr. Pemberton, Mr. Macready, you'll need to come with me. There are questions to answer and magistrates to see." As they were led away, Duncan turned back, his face twisted with rage. "That estate should have been mine. I'm the last male heir. Tradition demands it." "Tradition," Lady Margaret said quietly, "also demands loyalty, honor, and protection of those in our care. You failed all three, cousin." The study fell silent, except for the wind still whistling through the dropped acoustic device. Thomas retrieved it, the sound cutting off abruptly. In the sudden quiet, Caesar's mount seemed to settle into deeper stillness, duty finally complete. "Mr. Blackwood," Lady Margaret said, turning to him with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, "it seems I owe you more than just payment for taxidermy." "The work is payment enough, my lady. Caesar was exceptional." She studied the mounted wolfhound with deep affection. "He was, and somehow, even in death, he protected this house one final time." She turned to Bella. "My dear, we have much to discuss about your future. Your father's wishes will be honored, though I suspect you'll find I have my own plans for your involvement in the estate's management." Bella's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for weeks. "My lady, I never expected—" "Family is more than blood, Bella. Alistair knew that. Caesar knew that." She looked at each of them, Thomas, Hamish, Mrs. Brodie, Bella. "You've all proven it tonight." Morning light streamed through the study windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced like spirits finally at rest. Thomas worked with careful precision, making the final adjustments to Caesar's mount while Lady Margaret, Bella, and Mrs. Brodie sorted through Lord Glenmore's hidden documents. The constable had taken Duncan and Dr. Pemberton to Inverness the night before, but there remained the matter of fully understanding the conspiracy's extent. "Here," Bella said, extracting a letter from the portfolio. "Dated 6 years ago, just after Caesar was shot. Lord Glenmore writes to his Edinburgh solicitor about discovering falsified geological reports in Dr. Pemberton's published papers, data stolen from his private surveys." Lady Margaret studied the letter with growing understanding. "That's why Alistair became so secretive. He realized someone close to him had betrayed his trust, but he couldn't prove which of his associates was responsible." "Until Caesar was shot," Thomas said, applying a final touch of wax to seal a seam in the mount. "That proved someone knew about his message system. The wound pattern suggests the shot came from above, someone in a position to observe Caesar's regular routes." "The old tower," Hamish said from the doorway, entering with the tea tray. "Dr. Pemberton often went up there with his field glasses, claimed he was observing bird behavior. But from that height, you could see the entire estate, track anyone's movements." Mrs. Brodie pulled out another document, this one bearing official seals. "The mineral rights transfer, prepared but never signed. Duncan was trying to sell the copper deposits to a London syndicate for a fraction of their worth. Enough to pay estate debts, but nothing more. He'd have pocketed a substantial finder's fee. While the real wealth remained hidden, Lady Margaret said bitterly. Alastair estimated the copper could yield hundreds of thousands of pounds over 20 years, properly managed. Enough to transform the entire region, provide employment, fund schools. A knock at the door interrupted them. The constable's deputy entered, looking apologetic but determined. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but there's been a development. Dr. Pemberton's housekeeper found something you should see." He produced a leather journal, its pages filled with Pemberton's precise handwriting. Lady Margaret opened it, reading aloud. October 15. Administered increased dosage to AG, heart rhythm increasingly irregular. Estimate no more than 2 weeks. And here, October 28, AG nearly discovered the acoustic devices during his search for surveillance equipment. Convinced him his suspicions were symptoms of heart-related dementia. He documented his own crime, Thomas said, amazed at the arrogance. He thought himself untouchable, the deputy explained. His housekeeper says he often wrote medical notes that could be interpreted multiple ways. Insurance, he called it. If questioned, he could claim he was simply treating Lord Glenmore's existing condition, not causing it. But as Lady Margaret read further, her face paled. Dear God, listen to this. Margaret shows surprising resistance to suggestion. May need to accelerate timeline. Macpherson has experience with forced commitments, useful if gentle methods fail. They were planning to take you regardless, Bella said, horrified. The howling was just to provide justification. And it would have worked, Lady Margaret admitted. Without Caesar, without all of you, I'd be in an Edinburgh asylum by now, declared incompetent, possibly drugged into actual madness. Thomas stepped back from the completed mount, studying his work with professional satisfaction tinged with something deeper. Caesar stood eternal watch, noble head raised, glass eyes somehow conveying the intelligence and loyalty of the living animal. But more than that, the mount had become a symbol of faithfulness beyond death, of truth preserved against corruption. There's something else, the deputy said, producing a telegram. From Edinburgh. It seems Dr. Pemberton's asylum has quite a reputation. 3 women of property committed there in the past 5 years, all diagnosed with hereditary hysteria, all having their estates managed by male relatives who profited considerably. A pattern, Thomas observed. He'd done this before. And would have continued, Lady Margaret said quietly. How many women are trapped in such places, genuinely mad now from the treatments, their protests dismissed as symptoms? The question hung heavy in the morning air. Outside they could hear normal estate activity resuming, gardeners at work, horses being exercised, life continuing its ancient rhythms. But inside the study the weight of what they'd uncovered pressed down like the stones of the house itself. What will happen to them? Bella asked. Duncan and Pemberton. The deputy shifted uncomfortably. Conspiracy to defraud is certain. The murder charge, that's harder to prove. Digitalis can cause heart failure, yes, but Lord Glenmore did have a weak heart. A good advocate could argue reasonable doubt. Then they might escape full justice, Lady Margaret said, though her tone suggested resignation rather than rage. Perhaps not, Thomas said slowly. He moved to Caesar's mount, reaching once more into the hidden compartment he'd maintained. I found one more thing, sealed in wax like the others, but hidden in Caesar's throat, appropriately enough, where his voice would have been. He produced a small vial of liquid and a folded paper. Lord Glenmore took samples of his own medicine in his final days, sealed them with dates and his signature. He suspected the poisoning and created evidence. And this note, in his hand: "If you're reading this, then Caesar has given his last warning. Test these samples against proper digitalis preparations. The concentration will tell the truth." Lady Margaret took the vial with trembling hands. He knew. He knew he was dying and used his last strength to ensure justice would be possible. "A chemist in Edinburgh can analyze these," the deputy said, suddenly excited. "If the concentration is significantly higher than therapeutic doses, it's proof of intentional poisoning." "Take them," Lady Margaret said firmly. "Let Alistair's final message be heard." As the deputy left with the evidence, the study fell into contemplative silence. The morning sun had climbed higher, warming the room, banishing the last shadows that had haunted it. Caesar's mount caught the light perfectly, the glass eyes seeming to follow movement with benign watchfulness. "Mr. Blackwood," Lady Margaret said formally, "I believe our business is nearly concluded. Caesar is magnificent, exactly as I'd hoped. More than I'd hoped, actually. You've given him back to us, in a way." "He never really left, my lady. The loyalty, the protection, that was always here. I just gave it form again." She smiled, moving to stand beside the mount. "Alistair would have appreciated the poetry of it. His faithful hound, still guarding even after death. Though I suspect Caesar's work is finally done now." "What will you do?" Thomas asked. "With the estate, the copper deposits? What Alistair plan?" "Develop them responsibly. Use the profits to improve conditions for our tenants, fund education, provide employment. Bella will help me. She has her father's mind for business and, I suspect, better judgment about people." Bella flushed slightly. "I still can't quite believe, to be acknowledged, accepted." "Family," Lady Margaret said firmly, "is about choice as much as blood. Alistair chose to protect you, even if he couldn't publicly claim you. I choose to honor that protection and extend it. You're not just his daughter, you're my ward now, my companion, my heir if I choose to make you so." Mrs. Brodie, who'd been silent throughout, finally spoke. "The household will need to know, my lady, the truth about everything, the poisoning, the howling, Miss Bella's parentage. Yes, secrets have caused enough damage to this house. We'll have truth now, however uncomfortable." Lady Margaret turned to Thomas. "Though I suspect you prefer to avoid notoriety, Mr. Blackwood." "The papers will make quite a sensation of this. Mysterious taxidermist solves Highland murder." Thomas grimaced at the thought. "I'm a craftsman, my lady. I prefer my work to speak for itself." "Then we'll ensure your name is protected. You came here to practice your trade and did so admirably. The rest," she gestured vaguely, "the rest was simply Highland hospitality, helping a widow in distress." Outside, church bells began to ring. Sunday morning, Thomas realized. The Sabbath, when even the most industrious Scots set aside worldly concerns. It seemed appropriate somehow, this pause in the drama, this moment of peace in a house that had known too little of it recently. "Will you stay for services?" Lady Margaret asked. "The village will talk regardless, but your presence might suggest normalcy." Thomas considered. His work here was essentially complete. London commissions waited. His Edinburgh workshop needed attention. But something about this moment, these people, this strange tale of loyalty transcending death, made him reluctant to leave just yet. "Perhaps a few more days," he said, "to ensure Caesar settles properly in his position, you understand. Professional thoroughness." Lady Margaret's knowing smile suggested she understood perfectly. The drawing room at Glenmore had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom, though Lady Margaret insisted on maintaining civilized comfort, tea service, proper chairs, afternoon light filtering through tall windows. The local magistrate, Sir Andrew Mackay, had arrived from Inverness, along with 2 Edinburgh lawyers and a chemist from the Royal College. The promise of scandal had drawn them like moths to flame, though Lady Margaret's reputation ensured they maintained proper decorum. Thomas stood beside Caesar's mount, which had been moved to the drawing room for the proceedings. The Wolfhound's presence seemed to steady Lady Margaret, who sat composed in black silk, while the chemist, a nervous young man named Hartwell, presented his findings. "The concentration of digitalis in Lord Glenmore's preserved samples," Hartwell announced, consulting his notes with scientific precision, "exceeded therapeutic doses by 300%. Such levels would inevitably cause cardiac arrest, particularly in a patient with existing heart weakness." Sir Andrew leaned forward. "You're saying this was intentional poisoning?" "I'm saying no competent physician could accidentally prescribe such doses. Either Dr. Pemberton was criminally negligent or deliberately murderous." Duncan Macready, brought from custody for the hearing, erupted from his chair. "This is absurd! Fabricated evidence from a dead dog!" "Sit down, Mr. Macready," Sir Andrew commanded. "You'll have your moment to speak." Dr. Pemberton, shackled between 2 constables, maintained his composure with effort. Lord Glenmore was resistant to treatment. He often doubled his own doses, believing more medicine meant faster recovery. I documented his non-compliance repeatedly. "Then explain this," the Edinburgh lawyer said, producing Pemberton's own journal. "Your private notes detail exact dosages administered, far exceeding what you claim to have prescribed. Your own hand condemns you, sir." The room fell silent as Pemberton realized his meticulous record-keeping had become his noose. His face, previously flush with indignation, drained of color. Those were theoretical calculations. Medical research into digitalis toxicity, research conducted on a living patient without his knowledge or consent." Sir Andrew's tone could have frozen Highland streams. "That's murder, Dr. Pemberton, dressed in medical terminology." Bella entered quietly, carrying a wooden box Thomas recognized as Lord Glenmore's private correspondence case. She'd spent the morning reviewing letters with the lawyers, finding more evidence of the conspiracy's depth. "Sir Andrew," she said formally, "we've discovered additional correspondence between Mr. Macready and London mining syndicates, dated before Lord Glenmore's death. They discuss the estate's potential value once obstacles to development were removed." "I was protecting the estate's future," Duncan protested. "Alistair was sitting on fortune while the property crumbled. Someone had to think practically, so you conspired to murder him." Lady Margaret's voice cut through his justifications like Highland wind. "You smiled at his table, called him cousin, and plotted his death for profit?" "We gave him dignity," Duncan snapped, his careful control finally breaking. a natural death from his heart condition, mourned and honored. Better than watching him descend into paranoid madness, destroying everything with his delusions about preserving the old ways. Except he wasn't delusional, Thomas interjected. The copper deposits are real. The preservation plans were viable. You killed him for greed, then tried to drive Lady Margaret mad to complete your theft. Sir Andrew stood, his authority filling the room. I've heard enough. Duncan Macready and Elias Pemberton, you'll be bound over for trial on charges of murder, conspiracy to defraud, and attempted false imprisonment. The Crown will seek the harshest penalties available. As the constables led them away, Pemberton turned back, his scholarly dignity finally shattered. That damned dog! Even dead, he stopped, seeming to realize how mad he sounded, accusing a mounted animal of thwarting his plans. Caesar was always an excellent judge of character, Lady Margaret said quietly. He never liked you, Doctor. Now I understand why. The room slowly emptied of officials, leaving only the household and Thomas. The afternoon sun slanted through windows, painting golden stripes across Persian rugs and illuminating Caesar's glass eyes until they seemed to glow with satisfaction. Mrs. Brodie entered with fresh tea, her stern face showing rare emotion. The servants want you to know, my lady, they never believed you were mad. The howling frightened them, yes, but they knew you were sound. Loyalty in this house runs deeper than employment, Lady Margaret replied warmly. That's something Duncan never understood. He saw only property and profit, not the community Alastair spent his life building. Hamish appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. My lady, the village has heard the news. They're gathering at the gates, not in anger but in support. They want you to know they stand with Glenmore. Lady Margaret rose, moving to the window. Below, Thomas could see dozens of people, tenants, villagers, the folk who depended on the estate for employment and stability. Their presence was a vote of confidence more powerful than any legal verdict. We should address them, Bella suggested. Tell them the truth. Assure them the estate's future is secure. We? Lady Margaret smiled. Yes, we should. You're a Glenmore now, officially or not. They should see you standing beside me. As the women prepared to meet the crowd, Thomas found himself alone with Caesar's mount. He made small adjustments, perfecting the angle of the head, the set of the shoulders. The work was complete, had been for days, really, but he couldn't quite bring himself to acknowledge it. You did well, boy, he said softly to the mounted Wolfhound. Guarded your master's honor better than any living creature could, though I suspect you're ready for rest now. Mr. Blackwood? He turned to find Bella watching him with those intelligent green eyes. She'd changed from her servant's clothes into a proper day dress, Lady Margaret's doing, no doubt, and looked every inch the gentleman's daughter she'd always been. I wanted to thank you, she said, not just for solving the mystery, but for seeing beyond surfaces. You looked at a servant and saw a daughter, looked at a dead dog and saw a guardian. That's a rare gift. I'm a taxidermist, Miss Murray. Looking beyond death to find preserved truth is my profession. She smiled. Is that all it is? Professional skill? Thomas considered. Perhaps not entirely. Loss teaches us to value what remains. Your father knew that when he hid his messages in Caesar. He was preserving more than information. He was preserving love, loyalty, the bonds that matter. You've lost someone, she said. It wasn't a question. My wife, 3 years ago, consumption. The words came easier than expected. She would have liked this story, justice served by a faithful dog and a determined household. She would have liked you helping achieve that justice. Before Thomas could respond, Lady Margaret returned, looking somehow younger despite her mourning dress. The village is reassured. They're particularly pleased that Bella will be helping manage the estate. Apparently, her kindness to tenants' children hasn't gone unnoticed. Children recognize honesty, Bella said, blushing slightly. As do dogs, Lady Margaret added, looking at Caesar. Which brings me to a proposal, Mr. Blackwood. I've decided to establish a small museum here at Glenmore, displaying Alastair's natural history collection properly. Would you consider taking additional commissions? There are several specimens that need restoration, and I'd trust no one else with the work. Thomas thought of his Edinburgh workshop, the waiting London commission, his orderly life of preservation and solitude. Then he looked at these two women who'd faced down conspiracy with courage. At Caesar, standing eternal watch. At the Highland light, painting everything in shades of gold and promise. I could perhaps return periodically, he heard himself say. The London work won't take more than a month. Excellent. Lady Margaret's smile suggested she'd expected this answer. And Mr. Blackwood? I'm hosting a memorial dinner tonight for those who helped preserve my husband's legacy. You're not just invited, your presence is essential. After all, you gave Caesar back his voice when it mattered most. That evening, as Thomas dressed for dinner in his modest room, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. He'd come to practice his craft, to preserve dead flesh in lifelike form. Instead, he'd helped preserve truth, protect innocence, and perhaps most surprisingly, he'd found himself caring again about living people and their struggles.
Through his window, he could see the moors stretching toward mountains, eternal and indifferent to human schemes. Yet in this stone house, human loyalty had transcended death itself, carrying messages of love and warning through the preserved remains of a faithful hound. 3 weeks had passed since the arrests, and November had settled over the Highlands like a gray wool blanket. Thomas stood in his workshop, carefully packing his tools for the journey back to Edinburgh. The London Commission awaited, a magnificent golden eagle for the Natural History Museum, but he found himself reluctant to leave Glenmore's strange peace. The trial had been swift, justice served with Scottish efficiency. Duncan Macready would spend 20 years at hard labor, his dreams of wealth crushed like Highland granite. Dr. Pemberton faced the gallows for murder, though appeals would likely commute this to life imprisonment.
The Edinburgh asylum he'd used for his schemes was under investigation, with 3 women already released to their relieved families. Thomas wrapped his favorite scalpels in oiled cloth, each tool a familiar friend that had served him through countless preservations. Yet, Caesar had been different from any commission before, not just preserving an animal, but revealing truth, protecting innocence, completing a dead master's final wish. You'll miss the evening train if you don't hurry, Bella said from the doorway. She wore a gray dress now, appropriate for a woman of property, in half-mourning for an acknowledged father. The village had accepted her new status with surprising ease, Highland pragmatism overcoming scandal when faced with her obvious competence. The next one serves just as well, Thomas replied, continuing his methodical packing. I've learned not to rush endings. They have their own rhythm. She entered the workshop, now cleared of its preserved occupant. Caesar stood in the main hall, positioned where he could watch both the front entrance and the study door.
eternal guardian of the house's thresholds. Lady Margaret has something for you. A parting gift, she says, though she insists it's not really goodbye. They walked together through the house Thomas had come to know so well. Each room held memories now. The Chinese drawing room, where he'd first met Lady Margaret's grief. The library, where they'd decoded Lord Glenmore's messages. The study, where truth had finally overwhelmed deception. Lady Margaret waited in the morning room, its windows facing east toward the rising sun. The copper mining operation had begun 2 weeks ago, carefully managed to preserve the estate's beauty while extracting its wealth. The first profits would fund a school in the village, fulfilling Lord Glenmore's vision. "Mr. Blackwood," she greeted him warmly, "I have several things for you. First, this." She handed him a leather case containing a magnificent set of German surgical instruments, far finer than anything in his current collection. These were Alistair's. He used them for his anatomical studies, but I think he'd want someone to use them for preservation, the good kind, the kind that honors rather than exploits. Thomas accepted the case reverently. The tools were perfectly balanced, maintained with the care of a true naturalist. "I'm honored, my lady." "There's also this." She produced an envelope, heavy with quality paper. "A letter of recommendation to the Royal Scottish Museum. They're seeking a master taxidermist for a new exhibition on Highland fauna. The position would allow you to maintain your Edinburgh workshop while taking prestigious commissions." "Lady Margaret, and finally," she interrupted gently, "a standing invitation. Glenmore will always have room for you, whether for work or simply rest. You've become part of this house's story, Mr. Blackwood." That connection doesn't end because the immediate crisis is past. Before Thomas could respond, Mrs. Brodie appeared. "Begging pardon, my lady, but there's something Mr. Blackwood should see before he leaves." They followed the housekeeper to the main hall, where Caesar held his watch. But he wasn't alone. A living dog sat beside the mount, a young Irish wolfhound, perhaps 6 months old, with the same gray coat and intelligent eyes. "He appeared this morning," Hamish said, emerging from the shadows where he'd been observing. "Just walked up to the door and sat down like he belonged here. Won't move from Caesar's side." The puppy looked up at Thomas with an expression of patient waiting, as if he'd been expecting him. There was something familiar in those eyes, an echo of the loyalty Thomas had spent weeks preserving in glass and wire. "Lord Glenmore ordered him before he died," Lady Margaret explained softly. "From the same breeder who provided Caesar. He arrived yesterday from Ireland. We thought to name him Brutus, keeping the Roman theme, but perhaps," she looked at Thomas meaningfully, "perhaps you should name him. After all, you understand better than anyone what Caesar represented." Thomas knelt beside the puppy, who immediately placed a paw on his knee with gentle insistence. The gesture was so reminiscent of descriptions of Caesar's behavior that Thomas felt a chill despite the warm room. Here was continuation, not resurrection, but succession, life carrying forward what death had ended. "Augustus," Thomas said quietly, "the one who came after Caesar and built something lasting." "Perfect," Bella said, and Thomas realized she was crying. "Father would have loved that." The puppy, Augustus, barked once, as if in approval, then returned his attention to the mounted Caesar. The two dogs, one preserved in eternal vigilance, one beginning his watch, created a tableau that spoke of continuity beyond individual lives. "He's yours if you want him," Lady Margaret said. "Every taxidermist needs a living reminder of why preservation matters.
and Augustus seems to have chosen you already." Thomas thought of his solitary Edinburgh workshop, the quiet rooms where he practiced his craft in isolation. Then he looked at Augustus, at the eager intelligence in those young eyes, the promise of companionship that wouldn't end in another loss to preserve. "I'm not certain I know how to care for a wolfhound," he admitted. "You preserved one perfectly," Hamish pointed out with Highland practicality. "The living version can't be much harder." The great clock in the hall chimed 4. If Thomas left now, he could still make the evening train. But Augustus had curled up at his feet, completely trusting, and the afternoon light was painting Caesar's glass eyes with warmth that seemed almost alive. "Perhaps," Thomas said slowly, "I could delay my departure until tomorrow, to ensure Augustus is properly prepared for travel." Lady Margaret smiled knowingly. "Of course, and while you're preparing, perhaps you could examine the other specimens in Alastair's collection that need attention, just to assess the work required for your return visit." That evening, Thomas dined with the household one last time. The conversation flowed easily now, no longer weighted with secrets and suspicion. Bella spoke of her plans for the estate school. Mrs. Brodie complained affectionately about training new servants. Hamish told stories of Lord Glenmore's youth that had everyone laughing. Augustus lay at Thomas's feet, occasionally looking up as if memorizing his new master's face. In the hall, Caesar continued his silent watch, and Thomas understood that his work here had been about more than preservation. It had been about revelation, showing that loyalty and love could outlast the flesh that housed them. After dinner, Thomas walked the grounds one final time.
The November moon was rising over the moors, painting the landscape in silver and shadow. Augustus padded beside him, already learning to match his pace. Behind them, Glenmore stood solid against the night sky, lights warm in its windows, no longer haunted by manufactured howls. At the old ice house where Caesar's body had been stored, Thomas paused. This was where it had begun, a commission to preserve a beloved pet. But it had become something more, a testament to the bonds between human and animal, master and servant, father and daughter. The dead had spoken through his craft, revealing both murder and devotion. "Your predecessor was remarkable," Thomas told Augustus, who tilted his head attentively. "He protected this house even after death. That's quite a legacy to inherit." The puppy barked softly, then pressed against Thomas's leg, not seeking comfort but offering it, as if he understood the loneliness that had brought Thomas to this moment. They returned to the house as the village church bells chimed 9. Tomorrow, Thomas would leave for Edinburgh, taking Augustus and the memory of these extraordinary weeks. He would complete the London commission, possibly accept the museum position, certainly return to continue restoration work on Lord Glenmore's collection. But tonight, he sat in the study where it all began, Augustus at his feet, Caesar's mount watching from the corner. Lady Margaret and Bella joined him for tea, and they talked of ordinary things, the coming winter, the progress of the copper mine, the peculiar habits of Highland wildlife. "Alastair would be pleased," Lady Margaret said suddenly, looking at Caesar. "He believed in preservation, not just of specimens, but of values, traditions, the bonds that define us. You've honored that belief, Mr. Blackwood." Thomas considered his words carefully. "I've learned that preservation isn't about stopping time. It's about selecting what deserves to continue,
What truths should outlast their original form? Caesar taught me that. A dog's loyalty preserved became a man's justice revealed. Philosophy from a taxidermist, Bella teased gently. Philosophy from experience, Thomas corrected. Every craftsman learns from his materials. Caesar was simply an exceptional teacher. The fire crackled in the grate. Augustus sighed contentedly in his sleep, and somewhere in the walls, the great house settled into its nighttime rhythms. No howling disturbed the peace. No conspiracies poisoned the air. There was only the quiet satisfaction of truth revealed and justice served, preserved now in memory and mount alike. Tomorrow would bring departure and new challenges.
But tonight, in this room, where a faithful dog had once guarded his master and now stood eternal watch, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. The possibility of belonging, of connection, beyond the solitary practice of his craft. Augustus stirred at his feet, and Thomas reached down to stroke the soft fur, feeling life pulse warm beneath his fingers. Perhaps preservation and living weren't opposites after all, but complementary arts, each giving meaning to the other.